you write what you want in the womb.
It doesn't happen in life and it doesn't happen in books.
All life on Earth has evolved on a rhythmically changing cycle of light and darkness.
You're basically saying I'm like a dog with a bone.
A squiggly bone.
I want to spread black joy and laughter.
To read as one of us is to read 90% of stories not being anything about us.
Hello and welcome to another Penguin General Showcase from a London Bridge rooftop where we're trying not to be too morning TV.
Tonight we'll be giving a sneak peek at some of the brilliant new books currently in the works and out in the first half of 2022.
I'm very excited. If you saw our last showcase, you'll be aware of the huge variety of books that fall under the umbrella of our division, and tonight promises to be no different.
Our motto is very simple: publish good books that can be picked up and enjoyed by absolutely everyone.
We're proud to publish today's new ideas, new faces and new stories.
We have some literary gems publishing next year, from beautiful debut novels that journey from the streets of Dublin and Peckham to an imagined contemporary Trinidad, to an atmospheric grand house on the Dorset coast.
And then we've got groundbreaking non-fiction books that interrogate the UK's response to the global COVID-19 pandemic, challenge the Western history of science and celebrate life's bittersweetness.
So I want you to sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea
or a glass of wine
and your phone so you can chat along if you're watching live, and get ready to inevitably expand your bookshelves.
First up, we'd like to teach you all a new word for the day from the Nigerian Accent Dictionary.
So it's pronounced Huzband.
Gotcha.
Noun with two definitions.
1, a male partner in marriage.
And 2, a non-existent man in a non-existent marriage, whose whereabouts is often asked of, usually by Nigerian mums and aunties, to single British Nigerian women.
We'll let Lizzie tell you more.
Hi, my name is... forgot my name! I was going to say Yinka. Hi, my name is Lizzie, Damilola Blackburn, and I'm here to introduce you to Yinka, and Yinka's mum, and Yinka's aunties, and Yinka's cousins, who all want to know, Yinka, where is your husband? It always seemed to be whenever my mum did my hair, maybe because I was trapped between her two legs, but she would always ask me, so Lizzie, where's the boyfriend? Where's your husband now? At one point, I actually lied to her and told her that I had a boyfriend. And this is a common thing that, us Nigerian women especially have to go through. And once we graduate, the next question is, where's your husband? And when you get married, the next question is, where are the kids? And I just kind of wanted to poke a bit of fun in that and to bring a bit of humour. When I was writing the book, I really wanted to show the real Peckham, show how colourful it is, and just highlight key places such as the hair shops, the markets that sell those Ghana Must Go bags, Peckham Cinema, the chicken shop, the big Primark. You can never go to Peckham and go down a quiet street. It's just always busy and bustling, and people are always just hustling as well. There aren't any books out there that is a rom-com and has Peckham as a setting, so I decided to write one. So Yinka is a 31-year-old British Nigerian woman, and at the beginning of the book, she is doing quite well. She has a successful career, she has a mortgage, and then all of a sudden her cousin gets engaged and she decides, do you know what, I'm taking my love life into my own hands. She sets up a plan with the intention of finding a date in time for her cousin's wedding. However, what starts off as a very simple goal turns into something larger than life, and Yinka feels as though she has to change herself in order to get a man. So in addition to Yinka's search for love, this story is also about Yinka's search for self-discovery, which she does with the help of her amazing friends, and also it touches on what it means to be both British and Nigerian, and to date as a dark-skinned woman. Yinka, Where is Your Husband? Is out on the 31st of March 2022. Now over to James, who has a short history lesson for us all.
Where did modern science come from? We're usually told that modern science was invented in Europe, sometime between 1500 and 1700. We're told it was the product of a small group of geniuses, European men. People like the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus, who first claimed that the Earth goes around the sun. And the English mathematician Isaac Newton, who set out the laws of gravity. And then we're told that this story continued for the next 500 years. From Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory in the 19th century to Albert Einstein's account of cosmic physics in the 20th century. Science, we're told, is a product of Europe alone. But this story is a myth. I'm James Poskett, Associate Professor in the History of Science and Technology at the University of Warwick. And in my new book, Horizons, I tell the story of the global origins of modern science. Modern science was not the product of a unique European culture. Rather, science has always depended upon bringing together ideas and people from around the world. When Copernicus was giving his new account of the solar system, he relied on mathematical techniques borrowed from Arabic and Persian texts. When Newton was setting out the laws of motion, he drew on astronomical observations made in Asia and West Africa. And when Charles Darwin was writing on the origin of species, he consulted a 16th century Chinese encyclopedia, even having a friend at the British Museum translate sections of it, which later appeared in his book. More than anything else, Horizons is a celebration of the work of scientists neglected by history. Amongst many others, we meet Sachendranath Bose, a Bengali physicist who corresponded and later collaborated with Albert Einstein himself. The two developed a new statistical account of quantum mechanics. Indeed, the boson of the Higgs boson particle is named after Bose. We also meet Zhao Zongyao, a Chinese physicist who worked in the middle of the 20th century and who discovered through his experimental work antimatter itself. But his American colleague ended up being awarded the Nobel Prize, despite later admitting that he had in fact been directly inspired by Zhao Zongyao's experiments. Today, scientists are quick to acknowledge the international nature of their work. But in Horizons, I show that this story goes back much further than we think.
Basically saying I'm like a dog with a bone.
Sort of.
Yeah.
A squiggly bone.
I think I'm more of a thinker and you're a bit more of a doer.
It's about the things that you admire, not the things you want to improve.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Just to be clear.
Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Helen.
And together we're the co-founders of a company called Amazing If, where our purpose is to make careers better for everyone.
Over the past 18 months, everyone has re-evaluated and reflected on their career. 60% of people are considering a completely new career, and all of us have redefined our relationship with work. Careers are now squiggly. They're full of change and uncertainty, and we could all do with a bit of help sometimes to get unstuck and find our way through those knotty moments.
Coaching is a skill that helps you to achieve an UN of some description. It helps you to get unstuck, it helps you to uncover new options, and it helps to unlock your thinking. It's also unachievable for the vast majority of people.
You Coach You is a book written to help people to help themselves. It is about action and not inspiration, and it's designed with a single objective in mind: to be immediately useful and relevant for our reader. In Squiggly Careers, progression is about so much more than promotion, but we all have constraints that can often feel really out of our control. In You Coach You, we help readers to explore their possibilities, to prototype their progression, and to figure out how to secure the support that they need. Over the past 10 years, through our podcasts, books, and workshops, we've tested our ideas and tools with more than 1 million people all across the world. We know they work if you've got 20 years experience and you're thinking about trying something new. We know they work if you're trying to progress in a continually changing organisation. And we know they work if you're just getting started. We want You Coach You to be the book that you keep coming back to every time you need some support with your career.
I'm feeling quite peppy after that. Okie dokie. All life on Earth has evolved on a rhythmically changing cycle of light and darkness. Organisms from single-cell bacteria to complex animals such as ourselves possess an internal 24-hour body clock known as a circadian clock. This clock advises us when it is the best time to sleep, eat, think, and undertake a myriad of other essential tasks. Our bodies need the correct materials in the right place, in the right amount, at the right time of day. Thousands of genes must be switched on and off in a specific order. Proteins, enzymes, fats, carbohydrates, hormones, and other compounds have to be absorbed, broken down, metabolized, and produced at a precise time for conception, growth, metabolism, movement, memory formation, defense, and tissue repair. Progress in understanding the fundamental nature of circadian biology has been astonishing. However, in parallel with this appreciation, there has been an emerging realization of the fundamental importance of circadian rhythms to our health, well-being, and perhaps even the very fabric of our society. We assume that we are above the grubby world of biology, and that we can do what we want at whatever time we choose. And this assumption is completely wrong. As our society becomes increasingly 24/7 and we squeeze more and more into an already overcrowded day, our circadian rhythms and sleep have become the hapless victims. If we work against this deep circadian biology and are active when we should be asleep, brain function falls apart. Long-term circadian disruption, as occurs in night shift workers and our frontline staff, makes us more vulnerable to infection, cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and mental illness. So the key point is, many of the health conditions that we associate with the modern world are either made worse or indeed caused by disrupted circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms impact upon all of us, and rather than rejecting tens of millions of years of evolution, we need to embrace this biology. The key point is, what we do when really matters. There's a 50% greater chance of having a stroke between 6 a.m. and 12 noon compared to any other time of the day. Circadian rhythms will also influence how our food will be processed and whether we burn calories or turn calories into fat. And the time of delivering an anti-cancer drug can mean the difference between life and death. My name is Russell Foster. I'm Professor of Circadian Neuroscience and Director of the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute at the University of Oxford. I'd like to introduce to you my new book, Lifetime, The New Science of the Body Clock and How It Can Revolutionize Your Health. My central aim is to empower the reader by providing concrete information and guidance based upon the latest science. I want to cut through some of the myths and maybe burst a few bubbles, including the view that teenagers are lazy and that the business executive who gets up at 4 a.m. to start work is a role model. By embracing the knowledge in Lifetime, the reader can reverse some of the problems society has generated over the past decades and once again allow our biology to make us more creative, make better decisions, gain more from the company of others, and view the world and all that it has to offer with a greater sense of curiosity and wonder. The lives of both wise and foolish people all end in death, but in the context of my book, the circadian wise will, on balance, live longer, be happier, and lead more fulfilled lives.
Hello, I'm Ali Smith. My new book, Companion Piece, is about companionship where we least expect it. It's about the importance of freedom of movement in all that phrase's many meanings, but particularly it's important to the imagination, and about the importance of the imagination in and to everything. And that's all I'm going to tell you about it, because I'm still writing it. Forgive me, wish me luck, more soon, and all my warmest to you.
Hi, my name is Marlon James, and I'm the author of the novel Moon Witch Spider King, the sequel to Black Leopard Red Wolf. One of the things that makes this book different from most sci-fi and fantasy trilogies is that it's not necessarily a part 1 and part 2 or part 3. Moon Witch doesn't pick up where Black Leopard left off. Moon Witch actually starts the story over entirely, which means that there is actually no order in which these stories could be told. Many of the characters in Black Leopard Red Wolf appear in a different form or in a different context. Hero of book 1 may become villain of book 2 or may not even appear, because what it adds up to are different versions of the same story, different characters telling you what's going on. And you, the reader, are then left with the decision, the choice, rather, the hard choice of who to believe, because the books aren't going to tell you. A friend of mine said once that we double read books. I double read Jane Austen. In fact, I might triple read her. I read her for the story. I read her because she is a master of irony and she knows how to break her characters down. But I also read her as somebody absolutely foreign to this world and who would never be in it. That's a very long-winded way of saying eventually, as a reader, I will start to miss not seeing people like me in a story. And as a writer, I'm going to start writing the kind of stories that I wanted to read, and the key ones being stories that position people like me as a protagonist. I think a really, really convincing fantasy novel is a novel that reads like a historical novel. A really convincing work of fantasy is a work that convinces you that the world is real. Of course, it goes without saying that I'm hugely inspired by Tolkien. In fact, every now and then I have to go back and cross out these Tolkienisms that appear in the book without me knowing, me talking about people digging too deep as if they're the dwarves. It's one of the crucial differences between, say, A Lord of the Rings or stories of that kind and stories that what I'm trying to do is that we're still trying to separate ourselves from a kind of a European or Eurocentric view of fantasy. And if we're going to talk about fantasy, we can't escape that. The fact is that so much of our bedrock fantasies, so much of our bedrock fictions are European stories. At their best, they create new mythologies. At their worst, they're really just, historical novels with fairies in them. And it's hard to get out of that as somebody who grew up in that tradition, who read those books. But it was very important for me to sort of go beyond them so that I didn't end up writing what was essentially a novel with black people that's still basically a medieval story. You may not realize how much your mythologies are important to you. If I said to a British person, you wouldn't be here without King Arthur, he probably would know what I meant. But the Arthur myth and the Camelot myth is crucial to British society. It's crucial to the idea of Britannia being something noble and civilized and chivalrous and so on, even though the real history of Britain is absolutely not the case. Now imagine a person growing up where, for me, the origin narrative is slavery. So I grew up without that foundational myth. So in the beginning, I didn't start out looking for plot lines for a story. I went out looking for plot lines for myself. I went out looking for plot lines for my own origin. And it's in researching these stories, these myths, these legends, these histories, I saw a novel happening. The book almost wrote itself. I didn't go into this writing or this reading searching for example, queer acceptance. And we all know the stories. We've seen the news reports. We've heard, testimonies of homophobia in so many African countries and how it's sort of rampant and very acute. What we don't know is that it's also pretty recent. If you check the myths, if you check the stories, if you check the mythologies, African cultures have always found a way to absorb whatever you may call different. Because there is so much fluidity, there is so much flexibility and so much diversity in what we call sexual orientation, to the point where orientation was kind of an oxymoron. That sort of universe where so many identities are taken as a given, so many genders, so many orientations, so many attractions, so many challenges to the whole idea of masculinity and femininity and whatever those things might mean, that it ended up having this profound impact on the story. And that's not something I went looking for. It's something I found, but I didn't go looking for it. And that's just one of the many things, one of the many surprising things that this research led to. Another one was just the whole nature of African vampires. They're not wussies like European vampires who have to hide in the daylight. African vampires has no problem coming after you in broad daylight, which of course made for a really, really fantastic story.
And now Hannah and I are going to tell you about some books we're particularly looking forward to.
Yeah, I'm so excited to tell you about the second instalment of the Black Britain Writing Back series, a landmark series of rediscovered books by Black writers who write about Black Britain and the diaspora across the last century, curated and introduced by Booker Prize-winning author Bernardine Evaristo. The series celebrates pioneering books that remap the nation. There'll be 6 non-fiction titles published in February, spanning a time period from the turn of the 20th century right up to the present, telling stories that connect Britain to countries all over the world. Collectively, they will make you laugh, cry, inspire you, and definitely make you reflect on our history.
And now I'm here to introduce you to a magical debut novel, The Whalebone Theatre, from a new voice, Joanna Quinn, who feels like she's been writing for decades. A brilliant, beguiling novel, The Whalebone Theatre follows the fortunes of the Seagrave family, of commanding and imaginative Christabel and her 2 siblings, Flossie and Digby, who, largely ignored by their feckless parents, raise themselves until the next war comes and jolts their lives onto very different tracks. It's a book that spans decades and generations and is a wonderful example of immersive, big house stories, with Chilcombe, the crumbling manor on the Dorset coast, at the heart of the book. And it's a story about stories, the power of them, the love of them, and the importance of writing your own. It really is as magic as it sounds, and I'm positively fizzing at the thought of readers following the Seagrave siblings through their lives, visiting Chilcombe and meeting the buzzing cast of characters that give the novel so much life, from Russian emigres, bright young things, and the French resistance. The Whalebone Theatre engrosses you with vivid storytelling, beautiful writing, and sparkling wit. Old-fashioned in the best sense, this is a book that slots seamlessly on the shelf next to Nancy Mitford and Dodie Smith, and is the most joyous thing I've read in a really long time. The Whalebone Theatre is out in June 2022.
And next up, we have Emilie Pine, author of the smash hit essay collection Notes to Self. In the last few days, she's announced her debut novel, Ruth and Pen. Let's drop in on a Zoom call between Emilie and her editor Simon to tell you more.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, great to see you. One of the few joys of lockdown, it must be said, which we're now out of, thank God, and back in the office. But one of the few real joys was the kind of year or so that we were going to and fro on Zoom with each other. You were sending me material from this debut novel, Ruth and Pen, and I was reading it, and then we discovered that we could actually sort of have editorial conversations very easily by Zoom.
Yeah, I felt like you were sitting beside me the whole time as I was writing. You would ask me questions about like, is she really walking down this street? Because of course most of the novel is set in Dublin. And I felt like I was kind of explaining my city to you, you know, in part, not just giving you Ruth and Pen in terms of their character, but also how they are moving through the city over the course of the day. It was fun to do that. when you couldn't go there, but actually neither could I.
So it's a novel about two women, one teenage and one in her early 40s. And we follow them through the course of one day in Dublin. And the remarkable thing about the book, one of the remarkable things is how outside the action of the book is, that they are on the move, they're in the streets, they're passing through the city that they live in on separate journeys, although they do cross at one point, importantly. But being in lockdown and not being able to leave the house, what was that like? So, was there a feeling of freedom going into the novel and taking these characters for a walk that you couldn't go on?
Yeah, I really think there was. And also taking you for that walk too. And I think that sense of them being outside. Also, at several points they have to look up and check, is it going to rain? Because Irish people are always obsessed with the weather. But that idea of occupying the city, of inhabiting it imaginatively, it was kind of a journey of memory and going into some of my favourite buildings. They spent a lot of time in the National Gallery, and for me it was, again, that whole institution was closed.
Absolutely, and I think we talked about this quite a lot, is the way that through the drafts of the novel, this idea of boundaries, of having the courage to cross a boundary or a threshold, which equates in the novel with one of the great themes, I think, which is the courage of small actions, that what the characters in the course of this day are thinking about doing. Perhaps they're not on the grand scale of, declaring a war or, ending a life, but what they are both thinking of doing is exceptionally brave in ordinary human terms.
And also that for me was the joy of setting it over the course of a single day. It doesn't have a grand plot. Instead, it's kind of suggesting that tiny things change, and those tiny things are huge things at the same time. So that those 24 hours are really a revolution for both Ruth and Pen, even though they appear on a small scale. I always said to you, nothing explodes in this novel, Simon. Maybe I should make something explode. But actually, you always said, no, Emilie, it's internal, right? It's got to be internal.
Do you see, Notes to Self was non-fiction, it was essays, absolutely based on your own life and experiences, and written with great candour. How do the books speak to each other for you, as they seem to me?
Connection for me between the two books is that one is non-fiction and one is fiction, but that there's an emotional truth that runs through both. And that was really important to me, to have that use the word candour to me, and to have that sense of, and that's what so many people say. They say, oh my God, I can't believe how honest you were in Notes to Self. And what that tells you is that most of the time we're trying not to be that honest, right? We're not deliberately in any negative way, but just that sense of, it's very, very risky to expose who we really are to other people fully. And I wanted that for Ruth and Pen as well, that sense of they are completely open and completely vulnerable. And that idea that I had in Notes to Self, which was maybe vulnerability can be a strength, and to really go for it with both of these characters. Yeah,
and I think that rings completely true, and it's, again, something we've talked about, and I think it is that strength that you feel in both characters that does come through.
The truth is, I had always wanted to write a novel, and I told myself this terrible lie, which I think we often do, which was that it was too late because I wasn't in my early 20s, and I thought that ship had sailed. And then I wrote this completely unexpected book about my life, because I wasn't really planning on writing a memoir at all. And suddenly this door opened. I think it's an Irish thing sometimes. I think it's a female thing sometimes, that, can I be audacious enough to say what it is that I really want to do? And so this was just a joy to do. And I kept saying to myself, even if it doesn't end in something good, and it has, yay, but even if it doesn't, this is worth doing in and of itself. That was always the hope.
Yeah.
I can say that to you now that the book is finished. I could have said it to you. Oh, by the way, Simon, if it doesn't result in a book, it should be fine. Sometimes it feels like the narrative has been entirely defined by particular voices. And sometimes you have to grab that opportunity to add your own voice to the chorus. So thank you so much for giving me that opportunity.
Well, thank you, and I can't wait to talk to you about what comes next. And we already have talked a little bit, but right now I'm just couldn't be more excited to be introducing Ruth and Penn to the world next spring.
I know, next May. Amazing,
Next
thank
May.
you.
Lovely to see you.
Bye, Simon.
Bye.
My debut novel, Ruth and Penn, is out next May. And now we're heading back to London to talk to Julia Samuel.
On my Mum's Net podcast yesterday, they asked me to sing the lullaby that I sang to my children. And I said, you have got to be fucking joking. I am never, ever going to sing a lullaby on your podcast. So families matter. They are the bedrock of our lives, both when we have joy and celebrations, but also when we face hard times. And a really important message that I want to get across in the book is that there is no such thing as a perfect family, that all families kind of work on a spectrum of function and dysfunction depending on what's happening in their lives. And that could be that one of the parents loses a job, it could be you're living in a blooming pandemic, it could be that the grandparent dies, or you face all sorts of challenges. And that's when you kind of have to really pull together. But sometimes in families you need to be able to, it's sort of love in action, you need to be able to step back, you need to have the kind of dance in families of supporting each other, sometimes by withdrawing or sometimes by moving close. And so it is complex and difficult and demanding, but also it is, in the end, what gives us our greatest strength, that sense of being loved for whoever we are, that sense of belonging, that sense of having somewhere to go back to always. What I'm kind of showing in the families is that they are not perfect, they're really tricky and difficult, but how we manage the difficulty, how we allow ourselves to feel our fury, to feel our despair, to feel the pain, and somehow pull together rather than blow each other up, is what enables us to survive intact as families. Oh yeah, I love talking about the Wynns. One of the families which I think will be more and more common was the Wynn family, where the 40-year-old man that I was working with discovered that his father was not his biological father. And with me in 23, that is more and more common in my counselling room. What was fascinating about this family? So everything that mattered was never talked about. And the things that mattered was how you looked, was the chattels, was the house, was being seen as of a particular class. One of my most kind of frightening sessions was having his mum come into the room, who was kind of in her mid-80s, incredibly grand with a walking stick, and spoke in a really, really posh voice, and would not deal with the truth, and obfuscated, and just as she left, she said, "No, Robert was your father," and so that came out. But as we looked at her story, we kind of recognised the reasons for that wasn't because she was a bitch, it was because she had suffered so much trauma herself. So it's understanding the underlying causes of why people behave as they do that helps us have more compassion for them, more forgiveness for them, and then bonds can grow rather than shrivel. Coming out next spring is my new book, Every Family Has a Story, How We Inherit Love and Loss. And next up, a debut novel.
I am Ayanna Lloyd Banwo, and I am a Trinidadian writer currently living in London. When We Were Birds is my debut novel, and it is a love story as well as a ghost story. It introduces two characters, Darwin and Yejide, who are both outsiders, and in a city like Port Angeles with ancient matriarchies living in the hills and hustlers and dreamers just trying to get by, we find that their love is particularly complicated and has cosmic consequences that even they could never have imagined. So, When We Were Birds is set in an imagined Trinidad and Tobago, mainly Trinidad, and I've invented a city called Port Angeles. Anyone who's ever been to Trinidad will recognize it as resembling Port of Spain, but the geography doesn't map exactly or at all. It was more freeing for me to be able to sort of turn the volume up loud on Trinidad and make mountains closer than they were in real life and streets that go north, go south. Because I really wanted to create a sense that you could get lost in this place and no one would ever find you. That if you moved from the south of the island to the north of the island, that it felt like moving across a continent, and that there was a depth of history there that most people would not think would be contained on an island. I don't think I actually use the word island very often in the book, if at all, because I think when people think island, they think small, they think of something that they can easily know, something that they can easily pick apart and figure out. And the Trinidad and When We Were Birds is anything but that. As a matter of fact, the Trinidad and Tobago in real life is anything but that. Darwin is a young man, I guess on the cusp of manhood, raised Rastafari by a single mom in the country. And his mom is ailing, so he finds that he has to step up to get better employment in order to support both of them. But in a down-pressed economy, he's found that the only job he can find is being a gravedigger in the city that his mother has warned him off of ever since he can remember. It goes against the Rastafari faith to interact with the dead. So in the Old Testament, in the Bible, you'll see reference to something called a Nazirite vow, which basically says that not only that no razor, no scissors, no whatever should go upon his head, but that he should not have contact with a dead body, neither his mother, his sister, his father, and that if he did, you would have to cut your locks and then sort of begin again. So it's almost as though you become impure and clean, and then you have to sort of begin your journey all over again. So the fact that he would have to do this every day over and over, it means it's almost as though for him, he's making himself ritually unclean or impure every day. He would be breaking his vow every day over and over. Yejide appears to be a very different character from Darwin. You know, when we first meet her, she is waiting for the death of her mother. She is sitting at vigil, waiting for her mother to die and waiting to assume the mantle, assume the legacy that her family has been born with, and that is to shepherd souls into the afterlife. Her family is responsible for guiding souls into the afterlife. And one woman in each generation in her family has this responsibility. So as her mother dies, she takes over this responsibility. But because she and her mother have been estranged, she's never been quite prepared for this role. So she knows, she's grown up knowing that she has this huge and awesome responsibility she has to take up, but she doesn't quite know how, or she doesn't quite know how to do this, and she just hasn't been prepared. So when we first meet her, there is the sense of someone who knows that she is formidable, but isn't entirely sure of how to be that yet. So there is a lot of uncertainty. And so by the time she and Darwin meet, they're both people who have moved through the world with the sense that they are apart, that they are outsiders, that they bear awesome responsibilities on their shoulders. But they're both quite adrift and aren't quite sure how they're going to continue to do that, or whether that's something that they should continue to do at all.
matter what season it is, if you are vulnerable and unprotected, that's not good.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
The streets around Wuhan's wet market today lie eerily empty.
The largest threat, if we use the word, to the UK population is someone in China who's been infected from an animal, transferred to the farmer, which is transferred to community, and gets on a plane to the UK. What good is it for the UK just to be worried about what's happening here? It's about those interconnections across the world. It's the underpinning of why governance matters.
Hi, I'm Devi Shridar, Professor of Global Public Health at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. Over the past 18 months, I've been advising the Scottish and UK governments and running my research team analysing COVID-19 policies across the world. In my book, I tell the global story. I take you around the world to look how and why different governments took such divergent strategies to a common threat. We examine the very opposite responses of Sweden and New Zealand, both having excellent scientific advisors, but reaching different strategies on how to manage COVID-19, from accepting its spread fatalistically to going for full elimination on the islands. We look at how countries like Taiwan and Denmark, who controlled the virus, had more robust economic recoveries, and how Senegal and Vietnam, with weak health systems, fared better in their first waves than their far wealthier US and UK. We track the emergence of more challenging variants like Alpha and Delta. And I also tell you the story of the race for a vaccine, and unfortunately, the unfair distribution as global cooperation broke down and poorer parts of the world were left behind. Perhaps it will also make you reflect on how you have changed over the past 18 months as the crisis unfolded across the world, and how we heal, recover, and build back better as we look towards the future. And my book, Preventable, is out the 5th of May, 2022. Next up, we're going back to the US to speak with Susan Cain, here to tell us about her new book on the psychology of everyday loss.
We all of us, all the time, live in a state that you could see as a kind of combination of joy and sorrow. There's a beautiful Arabic proverb for this state. It goes, days of honey, days of onion. Right before the pandemic started, as it happened, I gave a TED Talk about these ideas. And I could tell that for some of the people in the audience, these ideas seemed kind of curious because at the time, people were living with the cultural message that everything was supposed to be sweet and not bitter. Everything was supposed to be honey and not onions. So why would you be talking about the power of a bittersweet outlook that really is dealing with both of those facets of being? But we're now living in a time where we really can't anymore ignore the bitter side of life, and that is forcing us to grapple with what is really one of the main messages I want to convey with this book, that we have two choices. We can take the bitter side of life and take it out on each other and social media and so on, the way we've been doing, or we can acknowledge the bitter and actively then work to transform it into something else, to transform it into creativity or healing or some other positive force of our choosing. But that doesn't happen until we actually acknowledge what the bitter is and the way it's constantly interacting with the sweet. My name is Susan Cain, and I am the author of the international bestseller, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And I'm here today to tell you about my new book, my latest labor of love, which I've been working on for over 5 years, and it's called Bittersweet: How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole. The idea for Bittersweet literally came out of a mystery that I have been wondering about for the last 25 years. What are the powers of a bittersweet and melancholic temperament and outlook, and why has our culture been so blind to its value? Aristotle actually asked this question 2,000 years ago. He asked the question of why is it that so many of the great poets and philosophers and even politicians of the day had a melancholic temperament. So as usual for this book, I traveled all over the place and spoke to hundreds of people and listened to their stories. And one of my favorite ones that made its way into the book is the story of a guy named Pete Docter, who is the legendary director at Pixar. He's behind movies like Inside Out and Up and Monsters, Inc. and Soul. So I found myself at Pixar one day just because I happened to be giving a seminar on harnessing the powers of introverted filmmakers. And I got to know Pete Docter while I was there. And I started asking him about the story of the movie Inside Out. It's a movie that takes you inside the brain of an 11-year-old girl and looks at her dominant emotions. And one of the emotions that Pete Docter chose to focus on in that movie was the emotion of sadness. I mean, it was sadness and joy. It just as, bitter and sweet. It was sadness and joy that were the two protagonists that he chose to illustrate the life of this 11-year-old girl. He told me that as he was making the movie, at first he wasn't going to talk about, or he wasn't going to focus on sadness at all. He was going to focus on fear. But then, as he was creating this movie, he felt that he was creating a disaster. Like, he felt that the movie was not working at all. He started to panic. He started to feel that all of his previous hits had been terrible flukes. He himself, at that moment, was starting to drown in sadness, and the effect of drowning in sadness was to make him realize how much his beloved community meant to him. And it was that moment that caused him to put sadness back into the center of the movie. And at the time, he was working with this famous psychologist, Dacher Keltner, who I also interview in the book and tell Dacher's story too. What Dacher Keltner had discovered is that we are actually bred to respond to each other's sadness. When person X is feeling sad, it triggers person Y to respond to that sorrow. It is one of the primary forces that brings us together, and we ignore that force at our peril. And we dismiss that force at our peril. We live in a culture that tells us we should never show our sad. And yes, I'm not saying that we want to be walking around mopily all the time. But there is a role for this emotion. There's something precious about it, and there's something transcendent about it. And we need to start reclaiming that. I'm Susan Cain, and my next book, Bittersweet, How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole, is coming out on April 7th.
It has been a delight to introduce you to just some of the fantastic pioneering authors that we at Penguin General are so proud to be publishing in 2022.
We cannot wait to share these books with you. To find out more about any of them, please just get in touch.
But now, to round off our showcase, we hand you over to an author who's written a book for anyone whose life doesn't look the way they thought it would, for anyone learning to find joy in the unexpected, for anyone trying, if sometimes failing, to build a new sort of life story.
10 days after I called off my engagement, I was supposed to go on a scientific expedition to study the whooping crane on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Surely I will cancel this trip, I thought, as I shopped for nylon hiking pants that zipped off at the knee. Surely a person who calls off a wedding is meant to be sitting sadly at home, reflecting on the enormity of what has transpired, and not doing whatever it is I am about to do that requires a pair of plastic clogs with drainage holes. Hi, I'm CJ Hauser, and I am here in my office at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. I was not prepared for so many people to see themselves in The Crane Wife, an essay I wrote about going on scientific expedition to study the whooping crane and calling off my wedding. The New Yorker crossword even ran The Crane Wife as a clue, And my father, who is a rabid crossword fan, was so excited about this that he said, "You're in the vernacular." 10 days earlier, I had cried and I had yelled, and I had packed up my dog and driven away from the upstate New York house with 2 willow trees I had bought with my fiancé. But that sort of broke my heart, because what that told me was that so many people had felt as mixed up and dislocated from their desires as I did when I wrote the essay. 10 days later, and I didn't want to do anything I was supposed to do. In a lot of ways, The Crane Wife is about how trapped I'd been by my own ideas, my own stories about the world, and what I thought my life was supposed to look like. And it's easy enough to say you're going to chuck an old idea out, but it is so much harder to ask what you might replace it with. So after the essay came out, I started asking myself, what kinds of visions of happiness and different definitions of love could I make room for? And so I wrote a whole book about that, like one does. And the book represents my working to release myself from these stories that I had about how life was supposed to be. It follows my search for new kinds of narratives, ones that have room in them for strangeness and for not knowing, which feels just tremendously more honest to me. I get up to a lot of different things along the way in the book. I kiss internet strangers, I officiate a wedding, I visit a fertility clinic. I try to court new ways of living, ones that value humor and grace above all, which I learned to do from Katharine Hepburn and from Shirley Jackson and from The Land of Oz. And I try to name more and different things love. In the book, I'm writing about partners and lovers and blood family and chosen family and children and animals and ghosts and a whole planet. And I hope the reader recognizes all of these as love stories. At the end of the day, I am a story addict, and this book is about trying to bear living with a little less outlining. I hope the book, for readers, is an invitation to suspend their disbelief and to go looking for new stories and new definitions of love and happiness on their own. My book is called The Crane Wife, and it's coming out in July 2022.
People love an actionable thing.
That's what I was going to say.